Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Gerber, editor of The Gathering Place and denominational minister for youth and young adults at Mennonite Church USA. And here on The Gathering Place, which you can find at www.thegatheringplace.us, we have an interactive website for Anabaptist youth leaders to learn, be, and connect. Every month we have a different focus that we are hinging everything that we do on. And this month I have been so excited to focus on the topic of Rewilding the Way, which is directly taken from Todd Wynward and his new book from this fall from Herald Press called Rewilding the Way, Break Free to Follow an Untamed God. So this month we've been talking about the question, wondering about the question of how in the world did we get to this tame Americanized Christianity? What is it? How did we get here? But more importantly is, how do we rewild and refind our passion again to follow Christ in a new way in our lives in this day and age? So excited to have Todd Wynward with us today to talk about this, to talk about his book, to lead us along into how to rediscover who we're called to be again. So Todd, welcome to The Gathering Place. We're so excited to have you. Yeah, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a delight. I'm here in Taos, New Mexico, saying hi. Hi, Tori. Should I go ahead and start then? Excellent. So I'm going to begin really. Rewilding the Way is something that could be seen as fairly superficial and light and fun, or it could be considered some of the deepest work that we need to do as God's people in today's climate and world. And I'm interested in the fact that I've never had a chance before to vet or talk with a group of youth ministers who all are, to some degree, familiar with my book. And because of that, I wanted to ask.
Sorry, hi Lois. I just wanted to say, Lois, could you mute yourself here? That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry, Scott.
Hello. So I was interested in starting by just knowing a little bit about your engagement with the book. So it's okay if you haven't read a single word yet, but some of you seem to have some working knowledge already. And so I wanted to ask you, how do the themes of Rewilding the Way, how are they relevant to you personally, in your personal life, with youth you work with the Mennonite denomination, with Christianity as a whole, or with our larger society? So you can take it any level, but I'd love to, what's resonating with you with the themes of Rewilding the Way in this day and age, everything from the personal to the larger global? I'd love to have each person just weigh in for perhaps a minute on that question.
And also, in the meantime, feel free to chat or write down your comments too in the chat box, and I can also field those out. But who wants to get us started? Why was this webinar? And I don't know what drew you to join in this afternoon here for an hour. Who wants to get us started?
I'll say something. Am I back on?
Yes, you are.
Well, having spent 14 years, what we learned through that, but I'm just noticing more and more that we seem to be living out of fear of so many things, and they're so averse to risk-taking and the good things that come from growth and risk-taking. So, and I think the example of Jesus was much more risky and wild than we live our faith out now. I want to get back to something that's more akin to that.
Oh, well said. Thank you, Mike.
And don't be shy. Who else would like to talk about why today? What does rewilding mean?
I'll share.
Thanks, Ashley.
I just graduated Bluffton University last year, so I was in the college atmosphere of kind of anything goes, and now I am in my first year at Arthur Mennonite Church as their pastor of youth and worship. And so when I saw your book, actually my cousin saw it, and he really enjoyed it. And I'm through part 1, so I've only read part 1 of your book, but I'm working on it. And as I'm reading it, it's reminding me of just in at least the Bluffton atmosphere, we're encouraged to, study it and ask questions. And I feel like once you get back into a Amish-filled area that Arthur, Illinois is, you kind of are safe in this little bubble. And so, in a way, I like it just because I feel like I need to continually remind myself to keep the way of God, wild as Jesus had it. And so that's kind of what I'm working with while I'm reading through your book.
All right. Who else?
I'll chime in here. Connects with me in a number of different levels. One is just kind of noticing as participation in church kind of is on a general decline. And as I think about my children and what will be the faith communities that will support them in the future, I mean, this just kind of helps me to spark the imagination about what might be possible for faith communities to look like here in the next number of decades. We're studying it as a church at Plains Mennonite Church, and it's really capturing the imagination of all ages. And then on a personal level, I will be going with my family. Todd and I have been in conversation going with my family to Taos for several weeks as a kind of sabbatical pilgrimage. And it just kind of really sparked, as my wife Paul and I have talked about our family life, just thinking about how we want to live our lives in somehow in a radical way, a different way with our kids, and help them to imagine a different way of living the good life. And so this has just really sparked our imagination about different things that might be possible. So, we cut our cable here yesterday as one small step, kind of cut the ties with the empire.
Wow.
And so this whole kind of theme of Star Wars of kind of resisting the empire, just kind of imagining different ways in which we can start resisting the empire in more practical, radical ways.
Well said. Thank you, John. I want everybody to do it, so somebody else should come up when they can.
Yeah, we can say something. Meg and I haven't read the book, so we're not aware of exactly what it says.
In fact, I don't really know much of anything about the book, so we're coming from kind of nowhere, but it sounded interesting from what we have heard.
We're service adventure leaders in Colorado Springs, so we live with 4
young adults, high school grads.
Yeah, 18 through 20. So yeah, we're just interested in ways to kind of revitalize approaches to Christianity, especially like living in community and what that may mean. And yeah, so yeah, we don't know a lot, but we're excited about the topic.
Excellent.
Tori Dirksen from Denver, and I've read the book. I think I resonate with our family trying to keep taking steps bit by bit on how we change our lifestyle, especially living in such an urban context for us, which my wife and I did not grow up urban, and being like a one-car family for over a year now, even though my daughter who's laying on the floor and I bicycle with my other son in like snow and ice. So stuff like that where the rubber literally, I guess, meets the road. And then the other part I resonate with is just that not only the idea of small steps, but also support and long-term support. Maybe not the legalism that a lot of Mennonites have in our history, but what does it mean to offer that mutual ongoing support even if we do it in different ways? Yep.
Nice.
Hey Lois, is there anything that connected with you regarding coming on this this webinar?
Well, the whole book actually caught my interest.
Hey, all right.
Yeah. So it's pretty much, it's kind of right up the alley of what I've been wanting to do with youth ministry and things I've wanted to pursue. So I'm just interested to kind of see what you have to say and what this whole webinar is going to be about.
Good.
And I would say, even just for myself, like, you know, regarding millennials and wanting more, and you hear so much about what does authentic faith formation mean, and how, you know, they want to be the church, not just go to church. And so I think that this concept of rewilding the way is, I don't know, I think it's meeting the needs and meeting the longing. And so I'm just curious, Todd, as far as like what you suggest on how do we create that type of people of the way, to really, yeah, do that. That wasn't very well said, but anyhow, hopefully you know what I mean.
Yes. I think everyone has had a chance to speak who can speak. Is that right? Good. Well, first of all, thank you. It means a lot, and I know you might not be expecting to be all that interactive. And if you don't know, if you haven't heard of the book, if you haven't read much, thank you for being here. And those of you who have dug into it, especially, thank you for being here. And I may draw on your wisdom, thought, or response along the way. Just to take, I think I'll take about 5 minutes of just kind of trying to lay out probably a lot of what you know already. But the premise of the book is, how have we become so tame as wild Christians, and what can we do to become the people that God has always wanted us to be? In this historical moment, what kind of prophetic people might we be? It's interesting, I've been researching Henry David Thoreau and the Civil War. My job is that I get paid for right now is to write curriculum for social studies. And there are many, many parallels between the Civil War era that was dependent upon this peculiar institution of slavery with our own peculiar institution of petroleum addiction. And there were a lot of nice Christians back then, 160 years ago, who knew slavery was wrong. And yet there were only a few that dared to interrupt their lives enough to change, to risk, and become abolitionists, or in solidarity with slaves, or in working on personal practices or policy. But it was an economic need. They were addicted to the institution of slavery and couldn't imagine an economic system without it. Today, we can't imagine an economic system without overconsumption based upon petroleum. And somehow our own Christian tradition has become co-opted. We've become way too tame. What identifies us economically as different from the rest of the world around us? And economically then, of course, about the way we think and such. And I really loved how you said, John, I think you might have mentioned the word reimagining or increasing your imagination 4 or 5 times in the short span that you talked. And that's really, for me, at the base of it all is, can we imagine a different reality for us so that we are robust, vibrant, socially transformative, earth-honoring, despair-crushing, intoxicated with life Christians? How do we do that? For me, one of the places I've gone is to the Bible. I don't naturally do that in public. I'm not a professional religious person. I've attempted to change society through public education reform, and through personal lifestyle change and ecological activism. And in the last 5 years, I've come back to institutional religion. And in fact, this last year, I was licensed as perhaps the first minister of watershed discipleship in the world. I don't know. But the notion of what does it mean to be a minister of watershed discipleship is this, in John's word, it's a totally new imaginative space for me. It's a brand new thought. Watersheds are these data-driven, ecologically bounded, statistic-oriented scientific terms, and discipleship is overtly a spiritual formation and following term. And how do we blend those together so that we're looking at the zeitgeist of the nation and the country? We're looking at the front page and the headlines of economic woe and environmental crisis, and we're coming to that as people of faith in a way that's exciting and mature and rooted in our tradition. So I think this is the job we were born for. I think this is our time to help transition this fossilized, quiet, and captive institution into something robust and transformative and life-affirming for so many people who need that. Let me ask you a question again, just so we can be on the same page a bit together. I'd like you to imagine the youth that you work with 20 to 30 years from now. Maybe they're middle-aged. Maybe they have mortgages and they have kids. What kind of changes do you see happening in society and the world in the next 20 to 30 years? I mean both economics and planetary health. Just a quick check. Do you think that largely the world will be spinning along as usual as we are now? Or do you think that there are going to be some pretty huge changes coming? I'd love to hear briefly from each person about just their sense of what might be going on in the next 20 to 30 years.
I defer to John Stoltzfus. John's the prophet of the future, so whatever he says, I agree with. No, sorry, Troy, I didn't mean to jump on your comment there, but well, we certainly know technology is going to move at an ever faster pace, but I really don't know what that means. Yeah, I'll stop at that.
All right, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I was simply, it doesn't help at all, Todd, but I was going to say I'm not sure if I can picture myself in 20 to 30 years and the skill set that I'm going to need in 20 to 30 years when I'm not only middle-aged, but yeah, what does retirement mean for my generation? Or, I mean, instead of retirement, because sometimes that's so economic, what does, yeah, growing old mean for my generation? Yeah, so that was my first thought, and then otherwise I do think things are changing, and I don't know, do we only change when things get painful enough? So I probably reflect on that regularly.
John, you look like you have something to say.
I need to stroke my beard a little bit more for some thoughtful words. I have a hard time imagining or thinking about what change seems to be happening so quickly. And I'm not one who is quick to kind of adopt doomsday predictions. And I think you're right, Tori, in terms of it feels like sometimes real crisis needs to happen before we are willing to kind of make the changes that need to happen. So, you know, I think about sometimes the denomination in terms of is it going to take a real crisis, or maybe we're in the midst of that, to make a real change in terms of how we think about church. And similarly with the environment in terms of how we relate to it, yeah, I'm not sure what crisis is around the corner, and it's you might can imagine that there will be growing disparity between the rich and the poor. I think that will continue, and it'll be interesting to see where the church kind of lines up in solidarity with.
Thank you, John.
A hunch I have about the changes that church is going to take. Now, this might not have been your question exactly, but I think our churches are going to become more, I don't know, missional, transformative, smaller, less institutionalized places of being, where our passions for what we believe in is going to be lived out in real ways in our lives throughout the week.
Nice. Well, I may just come back in here, and that just thinking of that, what you just said, Rachel. I think the next question I was going to ask is, how should the church become, or what will the church become in the face of some changes? And I think becoming nimble, transformative bodies of decentralized discipleship, doing the work in our own places, without as much affiliation with national models and pledges of allegiance to certain codes, but much more on the ground, lived out, embodied Jesus following, is something that I both want to have happen and I think will have to happen as we move forward. But as the world, basically my take on this, that expressed in the book a little bit, is that we have never faced such an opportunity and a crisis as what we may be looking at in the next couple of decades. And I think about what's our current catechesis, what's our current spiritual formation training that we do, and is that going to serve us well into the future? I would argue that we need to get back to a much more place-based, nature-informed kind of Christianity that is then causing us to be a different kind of person. Thoreau, as I was mentioning, Thoreau wrote a famous essay called Civil Disobedience that many of us may have known. And he was looking at institutions, governments, that he wanted as a conscious objector to not support, much like what Mennonites have done with military and violence, and saying no to systems like that. Instead of civil disobedience, I think one of our biggest challenges today is consumer disobedience. The idea of what will I participate in with my pocketbook and what won't I, and what does Jesus or God tell us about that? I'm interested in you all as youth workers and youth directors. In some of what I attempted in the book, I found that looking back at our 4,000-year tradition as Judeo-Christians, I wanted to rewild some of the scripture. And are there any, I have a few to talk about, but I was wondering if any of you who have read the book found any of the scripture analysis that I did interesting, thought-provoking, or useful to the youth that you work with. It's okay if you didn't.
I just wanted to say I did, but I couldn't quote any. Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
I don't know who's talking. I really, the Lord's Prayer that you talked about, and then the Beatitudes. I feel like those are two very popular scriptures that people just kind of read through, or they don't read through it again because they already read it, so they already know what it says. And so I liked how you reworded those a lot.
Nice, Ashley. The rewilding of both of those, sort of the Beatitudes as an actual job description by Jesus, not just something to recite, and then the idea of the Lord's Prayer as a daily transformative contract of reminding of the blessings to give and to receive, are things that I actually have felt more while out in the woods, while out with other people, than I have when I am in church. And church sometimes is that glossing over of those things. And so bringing those out with kids, I was hoping might be a module. It might be a unit that you might want to just discuss sometime, or have the students read that, have your kids look at the Bible and look at the Lord's Prayer in a way that they might not have seen before. Thanks for that. I know Tori and John both had blipped on briefly. Maybe Tori, do you want to try it?
Sorry, I'm in the conversation with my daughter. Can you repeat that again, Todd?
Oh, I just said that I saw your face on there earlier and was inviting if you had a comment.
Oh, about the scriptures?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like a lot of the desert stuff. That's stuff I resonate with. Maybe it's because I grew up surrounded by desert. I mean, I was in the mountains in Arizona, but surrounded by desert. And the life that we can find in the desert, when that's usually not a place we are often drawn to, or where a lot of people are told to move to, or that's where, I mean, to put it maybe in a different direction, but reservations are put on, or just however, but to see the desert and the desert stories and passages as meaningful and life-giving. Yeah, that's all I have to add.
Nice. And for those of you who haven't read the book, or maybe you skimmed through it pretty fast, the desert is something that comes up again and again. And one of the initial things I do in the book is I talk about rewilding punctuation, that from the book of Isaiah, so often we don't view it as it was originally intended, that said, there is a voice calling, in the desert, make a way for the Lord, that it felt like it was actually a mandate, a command to the God follower, not only a premonition that Jesus will be and John will be coming from the desert, but rather this was 700 years before Christ, and realizing that this was done in the desert, and there's archaeological evidence of a 1700-year desert training tradition that we have in Judeo-Christianity, was just really a mindfulness that made me think that we may have missed one of our holy sacraments, that we have communion and we have baptism as two things that we know Jesus did and participated in, and we think are essential for Christian formation. But what about desert passage? What about time in the desert, or rite of passage removed from society? That happens again and again and again in our tradition. And so that really resonated with me, that this notion of needing to separate oneself from culture in order to speak prophetically back to culture. And so that rewilding piece, I think, is a basic 101 for someone who attempts to be a disciple of Jesus. I'm wondering if that resonates, or if anyone has a comment about that notion to separate out in order to find oneself, find God's voice as we come back into our roles in the world.
Yeah, I really find that an evocative thread, golden thread, that runs through the story of Scripture, kind of that movement in and out of the wilderness and desert. I guess one of my questions is, is that only physical, or is it also psychological? I think maybe it's a bit of both, but do you need both? And how do we practice that kind of renunciation, or kind of separation in our places, in our urban, suburban places? I'm certainly all for, I need to get out in the wilderness. That's what I need personally, on an ongoing basis. But I know it's not always possible for everyone, and it's not possible for me on a regular basis either.
John, what you just said, yeah, some of us, I mean, I think it's great to have it physically, and we obviously have a tradition of people doing it physically. One of the things I often, there's naturally people that say, well, that's an elite thing, that's a privileged thing, or it's a very desperate thing. It's one of the two. Either you're forced to go on Exodus, or you might choose to do an outward bound trip. What about people who are enslaved? What about people that are in occupations and in cities that can never escape that? So that psychological and spiritual part that you mentioned seems to really resonate I found it fascinating that even slaves under slave masters in the 1800s, they connected so deeply with Exodus, and then in their spirituality and in their songs, so much talked about going to the wilderness. And in fact, they use the term half-cooked Christian, go to the wilderness. Half-cooked Christian, go to the wilderness. And being halfway there until you go, they somehow found the ability to find an interior wilderness, or perhaps in the swamps and bayous and thickets around. But even as shackled people, they profoundly felt there was both a need and then an ability to get to the wilderness. So we have hope that it doesn't only matter where your body is. I was just in Portland this weekend with a group I write about called the Wilderness Way, that's at the end of my book. And they are inner city Portland people. But they craft a liturgical wilderness as they start their time together. And they drop their keys and their cell phones, knowing that those are good tools for empire and good tools for navigation of our world. And there's a time and a place for that. And I think that's one of the things I find fascinating, is knowing that there are times and places for wilderness and times and places for engagement. But some of the scripture I study and looked at and what I wrote about is, Jeremiah is a prophet who most people didn't like. He probably bugged people a lot. He was kind of irritable. And yet, at one point he says, "Oh, I want to get away from my people. If only I had a way station in the wilderness." And a way station in the wilderness feels like a metaphor that is very powerful for us today as we look at, oh, my people, look at where our culture is going and where our dominant society is going. And what we can do to recharge, and can our churches be support and way stations to provide wilderness for us as we look to those next couple of decades, is one of my questions.
Todd, I have a question. Do you have any practical ideas on how youth ministers can evoke this wilderness within their youth groups, or how our churches can, embody a wilderness so that we can hear and listen to God's voice and more clear?
I do. I think one of the things to frame out that is getting a lot of resonance is the idea of a Sabbath from technology, and a Sabbath from being useful. Both of those are cults of personality, right? We have to be effective. We have to win. We have to succeed. And so this idea of the usefulness of uselessness, of doing nothing for a while, or of taking an intentional Sabbath from technology and instead doing other things with mind, spirit, body. One church has asked me to pull out some of the scriptural teachings or the rewilding that I do in the book as possible modules for Bible study. I don't know what happens in your churches, but Bible study isn't very sexy anymore. I don't know. It's not. I don't know of groups that really get together and study the Word in a way that used to happen in Wednesday night pizza groups when I was a kid. And yet, there's such a rejuvenating wilderness power when we look at Paul, for example, and rewild Paul as tent maker and man who developed this concept of autarkeia that I write about, a Greek word meaning enoughness, that he says has learned to be satisfied in times of extreme want and times of extreme surplus. And this mystery of enoughness that he writes about is one of the core character traits that Christians are supposed to have, enoughness in times of want and scarcity. And bringing up themes like that within an inner city context might provoke a sense of wilderness travel. I don't know, I was wondering too what other people have thought of as they think about how they might apply some of the concepts that I'm writing about, or what they have thought about bringing a sense of wilderness or wildness to your youth group? Are there bright ideas out there?
I wouldn't call this a bright idea, but I keep just more retreat time. So instead of just 1 or 2 retreats, I mean, we now have 4 of them. And part of that's just to get us away. And part of it is also we don't have a lot of Sunday morning times if people don't show up weekly. It doesn't seem like that's a huge practice nowadays. So weekends we get more time, but it's also just that practice of getting away. And I think that can be built into other things. But yeah, retreats to get us away from our daily grind. And at least for us up at camp, usually you can't find cell service. So that's a blessing.
And that might be a personal discipline before you go, a consciousness of we're leaving this part of ourselves behind, and it's a good part, it's an important part of our lives, but for this time we leave this away. I'm wondering, as we think about youth work, and we think about what you just said, Toby, I think, Tori, the idea of breaking with business as usual is one of the themes, the subtext, the subtitle is to break free in order to follow an untamed God. And I don't say break free from what, that's up to you to help decide. Which things are we chained to? I wonder, though, breaking from business as usual, Thoreau, in his writings that I was just studying lately, asked this great question that I often try to ask myself and with the book. What shall we do with the time we've been given? What shall we do with the time we've been given? And what shall we do with the resources we've been granted? I think many of us might work with privileged populations that have some surplus and have some time and have some entitlement. We have this wonderful moment in history that is kind of like the wonderful wrapped in the terrible, or the crisis and the opportunity as one. And so I wonder, in terms of individuation, and I wonder working with students or kids or developing, we call them childolts when they're half child, half adult, this idea of what are you going to do with the time you've been given? What are you going to be doing with the resources you've been granted? It becomes a personal manifesto making. It becomes a personal realization that society isn't going to tell you what's best for you. And so if we can do that in an adventure context, all the better. But the interior wilderness of self-definition and the still small voice that the prophet hears is something that I think is necessary for the church. No one else is providing moral education or a space for them to examine and ask, who am I? How am I different from my neighbor? And so that idea of healthy individuation and asking the questions of who am I individually. Anyway, I'd be open to other questions or comments at this point.
I would love for you and Nate, I just blanked on his name. Yes, Sabbath.
Yeah.
I would love for you guys to write a book together, or a catechism together, better yet, anchored on wilderness, ecology, Sabbath. Yeah, you could pick better words than that, but anyhow, that's my last tidbit.
I just commented here on our chat feature that feel free while Todd's talking too, if you can handle the double the double span, feel free to do it. But thinking of Todd, I love what you're saying about having youth themselves prioritize for themselves, like this question of what are we doing with with the gifts that we've been given, the time we've been given, the resources that we've been given. Because I think we have in a society right now, we have this FOMO disease, this fear of missing out, and it's like we want to do everything. We want to, and it's just like we end up stressing ourselves out, and we see our youth, right now statistics show that they're the most stressed out, busy, hurting society that we've had, at this point in generations. And it's like, so what does it mean to step back? Which really is, it's a, what did you call it? Not giving into the empire. It really is a way of disobedience, civil disobedience in some way, to step back and say, know what, you're not going to tell me how to prioritize my life. I'm going to choose for myself, and how that intersects with your faith. I think that would be a really key component for us as youth leaders to help walk with our youth to help them navigate those things.
Wow, I think that, as a public education reformer, my wife and I started a school called Roots and Wings Community School 16 years ago, and we wanted it to be a farm and forest oriented public school. And our belief was that if we had engaged, excited, passionate students, they would be learning something, and they would do well on tests. And we actually, without focusing on standardized tests, the students are doing fine on them because they're motivated, because they are understanding things. And we go outside, we do wilderness trips, about 30 nights a year with our middle schoolers. But more than that, we do interdisciplinary semester-long units that focus on the subject matter at hand. It meets all the content standards. But one of the things that we also do, in addition to academic expectations, is we ask them to spend a night alone outside as a wilderness solo before they graduate 8th grade. We don't grade the solo. We don't tell them whether they did well on it or not. We don't require them to tell us what happened inside of them during the solo. But we just know, we believe in our hearts that spending time alone in discernment is good. And we give them a few prompts about how they want to be, as opposed to what their parents might be thinking for them or what their friends might be thinking for them. And how has their life so far given them both roots to root down into confidence and wings to try new things? And we ask them to write love letters to their family. We ask them to write appreciations to friends about who has given you something in your life. And so many youth in middle school are so into what they don't have, and if only I was this. And we ask them to name and be grateful for things that normally in normal business day for kids, they don't have the space to be grateful. So creating a vacuum of time and space where a student or a kid can say, this is what I love, this is what I value, these are my questions. I think that might be the deepest work we have today to develop our own individual accountability and strength, because I do feel like the crazy busy feel that the kids have and that we have. Some people, some of my favorite authors talk about the fact that we've become adolescents, raising adolescents, raising adolescents. And we are not exemplifying mature eldership as the adults in this situation. And we're chasing around the dominant culture values with our heads cut off, and we're fearing too much, hoarding too much, risking too little, loving too little, and we have lost a lot of that deep, deep confidence that God loves us as we are. And so we chase after so many other idols, and giving kids a space to not have to chase after other idols and give them that love that we know is straight from the heart of God is one of the greatest gifts we could do.
I noticed that we have about 10 minutes left here before the top of the hour. Were there any questions that anyone has for Todd as we continue to engage in this idea of what does it mean to provide wilderness experiences? or anything else.
Yeah, I'd love it just to add, if each of you could think about something that's on your heart, either a comment or a question, and be able to share that with the rest of us, that would be a nice thing. And then maybe the last 5 minutes, I'd love to talk about something else.
I'm curious as to anyone who has had success reintroducing some of the adventure stuff in a conventional church setting. And I don't just mean adventure trips, but just the whole attitude of, risk-taking, breaking from the norm. Many of us out east here have 200- and 300-year-old churches that have wonderful tradition and deep roots in communities, but it's hard to find new paradigms and new ways of thinking. And I just wonder, Todd, what your experiences or anybody else with changing the conventional church?
I just would like to throw this in. One of the things I wanted to say earlier about when Tori was saying, what are some forms of wilderness that might not just be your traditional outside? I'm in love with the fact that a number of Mennonite churches, Mennonite colleges, both Goshen and EMU come to mind, have a required cross-cultural component. And that's not wilderness per se, but it is that uncomfortable liminal space, that threshold space where you don't know the culture, and you start learning about yourself once you get into someone else's culture. And that kind of seeing the shadow, seeing the other, realizing who you are in the face of seeing so many others who are not like you, that's a required piece of both of those schools. And that's at least one way that I know of where people are getting outside of themselves, and they're doing it at an institutional level.
And I just want to piggyback on, too, I know I'm talking too much, but when you talked about initially wilderness experiences and where we've been, that was exactly where I went. That was probably one of the number one wilderness experiences I've had in my life. That was faith formational, was my study service term at Goshen College. But the funny thing is that even though I remember thinking this, even though I was in the midst of a culture that was speaking a language that, let's be honest, mostly I didn't understand completely, I still, in a deep, deep way, sensed the presence of God. I couldn't explain, it was like this presence that transcended all cultural barriers, racial barriers, language barriers, and yet that presence was still there, and I understood in such a deep way, what they were talking about.
Wow, well said. Does anyone else want to address John's question? I'm sorry, that was Mike's question, excuse me. If not, who else has a question or a comment that they'd like to bring up? I'd love everyone to have at least their brief moment in the light here.
One of the things that we've been doing in Service Adventure is sort of I guess trying to do some wilderness or some adventuring, and I admit that it works better probably in a group housing situation rather than a youth group, but we've been trying to do simplicity challenges, and it's something at the beginning of this 10 months of Service Adventure, it was something that Meg and I said we were going to do, and we weren't going to force the girls, the participants, to do it as well, but they all jumped on board and doing things that some that aren't necessarily spiritual, like carrying around the trash that you make for a week, in a bag or something, but then also things that are maybe a little more spiritual, doing a silent retreat together or doing a screen-free evening. Those sorts of things are kind of breaking from the norm of what 18, 19, 20-year-old would do, and giving them a little bit of adventure, a little bit of break from the empire, I guess, as we're talking about this. So those have worked, and I can't say that it would work everywhere, but I'm wondering if that would work in a youth group context or a Sunday school or a small group or something like that, where collectively you kind of do this challenge. We just have 12 in a basket. We draw one every week. It's worked really well. I've enjoyed it. And they have too.
That to me is exactly the kind of what one can do in their own situation kind of concept. I write a little bit in my book about something called Jesus Dojo, like taking the martial arts dojo, which means an arena of practice. And so what does it look like to do an arena of practice based on something out of the Gospels, or an experiment like you're mentioning, and just to say we're going to do this for 4 weeks, or we're going to do this for 12 weeks. One of the things that I've taken part in is this idea of a have to, give one. Like John's advice about if you have 2 tunics, give one. We started looking at our possessions and started divesting, and it's amazing how many shirts or pairs of shoes I had that I didn't even know I had, and then needing to choose half of them and giving away the other half turned out to be frighteningly simple. And I still had a couple of good, of that idea, but it was something that I took on personally, and then several other people joined in that way. And so having it be a non-binding, non-required, but voluntary risk-taking, you're adding an element of excitement and actual experiential testing that you might not have otherwise. We have about 5 minutes left, and I've noticed a few of the comments on the side, especially from my new friend John Stolzfus over there. And he has a couple of interesting concepts. I see a Watershed Discipleship Catechism and Mennonite Boot Camp. These are things that the church can and should do in our time. I'm not exaggerating when I say that earliest church catechism, as far as we know, the teaching of what it took to become a Christian, what we're finding out these days is it was potentially 3 years. And this is of a non-literate kind of training. This is not here, read this textbook. Here, score on this test. This was a learning by doing in an oppressed society where people were sharing their economics collectively, and they were getting burned at the stake, and they were getting eaten by lions, and yet the numbers were growing. People found it attractive. It was an alternative economy from empire. It was an an alternate society from empire. And that after a couple of years, then someone became a mature Christian, was entered into the deeper levels of responsibility and eldership. Right now, we're lucky if we get someone to say something at the altar and, hooray, you're now a Christian. Like, where's the formation in that? We're approaching the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism, right? In 2025, it will have been 500 years since our first forefathers and foremothers started doing the priesthood of all believers. I'm wondering what we will have to show for that. What kind of robust, counterculture, positive, alternative societies economically can we create? And this idea of a boot camp, like, that's what Gandhi talked about. In order to become a satyagrahi, in order to become an actual truth force, on-the-ground, revolutionary, transformative member of Gandhi's nonviolent campaign, he tried to have farms turn into training schools and boot camps. And the idea of making your own clothes, of getting your own salt, of not depending upon the British Empire to give you tea, these were all like taste bud transformation and money transformation, of finding a self-reliance and learning to do with enough, and finding joy in those things that empire couldn't give you. I feel like we're in the need for a lot of experiential training and development. And so if the church was a crucible or a campus for life change and taught classes that were bonding one another together in being more regional and replacing themselves into their watersheds and learning how to be one creature among many in your local area rather than the consumer that takes and takes and takes from somewhere else, this could be a robust kind of attraction of Christianity that could attract a lot of seekers today. So it's the most natural evangelism that we have. So on that note, I just would like to say thanks for listening and participating. I hope you weren't expecting me to be talking more in a lecture format. I chose to figure out that if you actually wanted to hear more of my words, you would read the book. And I wanted to engage with you in some of the ideas and try to ask some questions. So those uncomfortable silences, I hope, were comfortable enough for you, and it was for me. I really wanted to hear your voices and reaction. There's a few things coming up, just so you know, like John mentioned that his family is going to be the first ever family sabbatical that we're going to have out here at Tilt. Tilt is the Taos Initiative for Life Together, and we have a 10-room, 7-fireplace adobe. Like this is the roof of my house, and it's a hand-built, earth-built adobe. We have farmland and high desert homesteading and wilderness trips and watershed activism. And I hope it's a place apart where people can come and regroup and train and rejuvenate. And so if you know of students or yourselves or elders who want to take a time apart and engage with some of these themes in this place of high desert in New Mexico, let me know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm just going to link up to something on the Gathering Place, just to also let you know of the wilderness trek. Here it is, that Todd's going to be leading at the beginning of July, that John will also be a part of, and that we hope that maybe some of you will also feel free to join. This is a link that explains more about this wilderness spiritual pilgrimage that goes into the literal wilderness, the desert of New Mexico, that Todd's going to be leading, engaging us, as well as incorporating spiritual formation aspects to sort of get us to a place where we can hear and listen for how God is calling us to be the people God is calling us to be. So yes, definitely get in touch with me directly if you're interested in finding out more. I have a letter from Todd as well that I will also link up to this. I haven't had a chance yet to do it. That gives a little bit more details as far as transportation and equipment and more details. So yeah, Todd, you're a gift. You're a prophetic voice in this day and age that we need to hear, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us here that we're grateful for your presence with us and for you being courageous to say these words in this day and age. So such is the time, and I'm grateful for your presence with us. So continued blessings to you as you teach and learn and continue to lead and guide us in this watershed discipleship. So many thanks for each of you for joining in, and Ben, for you listening in, and for those who are viewing this as a recorded version. Continue to connect with the Gathering Place. We have more things coming down the pike this month. Our study circle, for those of you who have read or are reading Todd's book, we will be gathering at the end of the month at an evening time. Actually, it's an 8 p.m. on, I should have had this up here, I think it's the 28th of January. Let me just double check that. 26th. January 26th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be gathering together, same format, to talk about Rewilding the Way and how the book is impacting your life. So thanks again for everything, and many blessings on your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.